All right, let's see if this is working. I think the audio is working. Can people hear me? Yeah, seems to be working. Okay, good. Uh, yeah, hope everything's been going well. So I was away last week, so sorry about that, but I figure it makes sense to kind of go through the set that got released this week. So I guess it's basically all Negro League cards, right? Some mission, some packable, some clubhouse, but all Negro League cards of one form or another. So we'll kind of go through that. I guess I'll try to go pretty quickly this week, just because we've been running out of time for some of these in the past. I know the scheduling gets a little worse in this time zone, so doing the best I can. Trying to think if there's any news that does make sense to go through first. Let's see. I guess it's been a couple of weeks, so let's see. Well, so one that we at least didn't discuss on stream here were the changes to stamina. I know that's been discussed a fair bit elsewhere. It's really puzzling to me, kind of the reasons that they've done that. Um, I'm really actually struggling to figure out what the problem is that it was supposed to solve. Because basically, well, the issue is that we've got a game which is supposed to be, some kind of historical baseball simulation, and you want to make it as historically, valid as possible. But for example, we have a tournament set, basically during World War One, and we're now expecting every team to have to run at least four starters. And as best I can tell, this is a hard-coded implementation. And the reason I'm saying that is I did an experiment. I don't have a good way of showing it on stream, but I did an experiment just with some very quick hooks to get an idea of how the stamina works. Because, for example, we know roughly the way relief pitcher stamina works is how much stamina you lose basically depends on a combination of the pitches you throw and then also something about the leverage index. So that throwing a pitch in a high leverage situation is running your stamina more quickly than throwing a pitch in a mop-up situation. So there's some combination of these two things that tells you how quickly you lose stamina, and then basically stamina recovery is more straightforward. But here this seems to be something that was directly hard-coded, because as an example, I managed to get a pitcher in 1919, I think. What's the low goal? Let me double check. I think it was 1919, but I can confirm. So I managed to get a pitcher basically in that low gold. I managed to pull that pitcher after 40 pitches. So it's 1919. The pitcher was listed as a starting pitcher, but they were also pulled after 40 pitches. So we can then ask, what would you expect? What would you expect is going to happen as far as stamina recovery, right? And if this were something where the only thing they did was to play with the rate of stamina recovery, I think what we'd expect to happen is if you have a guy that really throws 130 pitches, which is something that can happen, in that era. So yeah, okay, I should say it this way. There are several different stamina effects that are era dependent. So the way it works for a starting pitcher is the starting pitcher starts with some amount of stamina. As they throw pitches, it decreases. At some point, it can hit zero, and they'll become considerably less effective. And this is what the aggressive tiredness hook is doing, is basically trying to pull them at zero, even if they're otherwise having a good outing. That's one way to think about aggressive tiredness hook. So you're depleting stamina over the course of the outing. And if you run an aggressive tiredness hook in a very early era, the pitcher still throws a lot more pitches than they do in modern. So that's telling you that the rate of stamina depletion is basically much lower in, say, 1919 than in 2019. And that fits historically with what happened. Pitchers in that era, when they were in the game, they would throw a lot more pitches than a modern pitcher does. So that all makes sense. Um, so you might then imagine that the penalty for that is going to be that if there's some change to stamina, a guy that threw 180 pitches maybe isn't going to be able to come back 2 days later, even though in 1910 they would actually typically have come back 2 days later, particularly because often there was a doubleheader. So often they'd be playing 3 games in those 2 days. But instead, well, if that happens, then you might then similarly expect that if you run a guy with a very short hook, so if, as in the example I gave, they're only throwing 40 pitches, they haven't depleted much stamina, it's going to be quicker for them to recover, and you'd expect that they should be able to throw, well, in that era, probably again the next day. But even if they couldn't throw again the next day, you'd expect that they should be able to throw the day after. What I actually found was the guy who threw 40 pitches still was not at 100% until basically the fifth day. So essentially a four-man rotation was required. And so it seems clear that this is actually a hard-coded decision rather than in other words, rather than being something related to stamina depletion. So this is the way it used to work in the past. So the way it used to work in the past was in a 1919 tournament, I'd have a choice. I could run 3 starters and they'd throw all of my pitches. But if instead I wanted to avoid the third time through the order penalty, which similarly seems to be a hard-coded rather than gradual thing, if I wanted to avoid a third time through the order penalty, and I wanted to consistently pull my starter after 18 batters faced, then I could usually get away with 2 starters in that era. Occasionally I'd fail because occasionally those 18 batters would be more taxing, they'd throw closer to 80 pitches, and I might need a swing starter. So I might be going with 2 1/4 starters or something like that. But here, even with that kind of strategy, it now requires 4 starters. So basically something's been done on the gameplay side. And I really don't understand this from a lot of points of view. First off, just core of this, it's a baseball simulation. We're trying to model baseball. I don't think there is anybody with any sort of historical credibility that would tell you that a team in 1919, if a player had started a game and exited after 40 pitches for whatever reason, I don't think there's anybody that would tell you they would need until the 5th day to be able to throw a baseball again. I think people would even not tell you that in the modern era, but they certainly wouldn't tell you that over 100 years ago. So we're moving away from historical accuracy, and that's always a mistake. Much in the same way that pitcher BABIP and so forth just isn't the way the game of baseball works. We know it isn't, and so we're kind of moving away from a baseball simulation when we do things like this. So if you're going to do that, there really needs to be a strong game design reason for it. In other words, as much as I've made my feelings clear about variants and combinators and so forth, I think it's clear that the reason that they stay in the game and the reason that they're still involved and the reason that all of these things are true, I think it's clear that there's a very strong incentive. They're profitable. It's a company trying to make money, and it's important enough to the profitability that they're willing to sort of take the game design hit to make that happen. So I understand the idea of basically saying either for profitability or for game design reasons, this just must be true. But I think those are the only reasons to do something that isn't a historical baseball simulation. The core of what's made Out of the Park Baseball such a strong brand has been this idea that it's the best baseball simulation out there. And so doing things like this really then it's puzzling to me. But also I don't understand why it's needed. There's some idea that there was a stamina bug fix, but this kind of hard coding, first off, makes it worse. Second, I have to be careful how I say this on stream. Um, if it's intended as a bug fix, it didn't work. And in experimenting with a little bit, it was pretty easy for me to find several tricks where I can find ways to artificially refill stamina on my pitchers in a situation where I want to. Um, I intentionally don't show this stuff on stream because I don't think it's the way the game should be played, and I don't use it. Not everybody feels that way, you know. There's a prominent member of the community, um, where we saw them, for example, find a way on stream against us to, run over 70 different players in a cap tournament in a series against us. So, you know, not everybody feels that way about the things that the game allows you to do. My sense is we're kind of trying to play baseball here, and so as much as I think this is a silly way to implement stamina, uh, at least for myself, I'm not going to exploit it. But I would say that there are a bunch of bugs in the way it's currently implemented. And if the intent was a bug fix, it didn't work. But it did very much change a lot of the design. So, for example, it does mean that tournaments in early eras now play less like early eras, which is unfortunate. I think part of the fun of a game like this is thinking about how players would do in different environments and what that value is and so forth. And I think if anything, we don't have enough. We don't have enough. We don't have any early era tournaments, and that's really a fun era of baseball history. It's a game that plays very differently than the modern game, and just as somebody that enjoys baseball and enjoys baseball history, I would enjoy the challenge of trying to build tournaments for those eras. Yeah, they look very different than modern, but that's sort of the point. And thinking about which kinds of modern players would work very well and which ones wouldn't and so forth. Um, so the stamina thing is puzzling to me. It's a 4 day 0 day exploit. No, but I think that's right, GSG. That I mean, inevitably the same things I've discovered, I'm not going to be the only person that has discovered. There are only so many things that you can play with in the interface. So there are going to be other people that have found the same things I have, and we'll use them at the right time. For this particular one, I have actually tried to figure out if there was a way to report the bug. Unfortunately, as kind of several of you know, the avenues that I would have for reporting this stuff have basically been closed. So I'm not the one that's able to do that. But I'd encourage you, if you find this stuff, to report it if you do have the ability to report it. They might as well get it patched. It's at least the case that if you're going to do this kind of thing with stamina, it should behave the way that it was intended to behave. But it's really puzzling. At the same time, it significantly changes the value of a bunch of cards. Because, for example, in the fact that low gold's been 1919, let's imagine that we had the shape of a card like the release Jim Jeffries. So essentially no stuff, doing well in the other ratings. The card really wasn't going to play in anything modern, but the fact that there was a 1919 low gold and that he could throw a third of your pitches there meant that a card like that would have value if it was the best of its shape. It's not quite the best of its shape anymore, so but of the release cards, it was an interesting one to look at for that reason. But the fact that he can now only throw a quarter of your pitches makes him significantly less valuable when he's only available for one tournament. So this does change that kind of value. It also probably changes, to a fair extent, the correct strategy in cap building for early eras as well. In other words, if it were possible to have only 2 or 3 players throw all of your pitches, then even with a very low cap number, it's sort of obvious that you want to maximally invest in pitching before you think about hitting. You're getting a lot more value for somebody that's throwing 40% of your pitches and therefore participating in 40% of your plate appearances than you do for any one hitter. But the more that gets reduced, the less that's true. In other words, with a low cap number in modern, you're almost never going to spend 5 max slots on a rotation. So it does change some of the gameplay also. The other issue I have with it is just in general, this idea of hard coding, I think, is antithetical to the idea of a game like this. OTP is supposed to really be built as a baseball sandbox. You're supposed to be able to experiment with different strategies. And I hate the idea of essentially saying this strategy looks powerful, so I'm just going to make a bright line rule change and outlaw it. I mean, I guess modern baseball does this to some extent. I also wouldn't have banned the shift. I think it's up to the hitters to hit the ball where the fielders aren't, and it's up to the fielders to sort of stand wherever they think is going to be most useful. But clearly I'm outvoted in that sense. So anyway, yes, the stamina was one change that came up. Trying to see what else came up. Yeah, anything else that came up in the last week or two that's worth discussing? Trying to think. I suppose maybe there's one follow-up to the discussion we had about where packs come from. So I had seen a brief discussion this week, basically trying to understand why prices weren't higher. Basically, there seemed to be fewer perfect points in the system now than there were at this stage last cycle. I don't actually know whether that's true because I haven't been keeping any stats on it. Anecdotally, I pretty strongly suspect that's true. If for no other reason than that I remember sort of at this stage in some past cycles, there being a couple of million-point cards on release on the very high end, and I don't think we've seen something like that. But in thinking about the reasons for it, I kind of started thinking about this and had this realization that it maybe just comes down to the difference of a small number of whales. And it's surprising that that's true. But the thing to remember is basically, one way to think about it is this whole idea of a money multiplier. That essentially when you put money into an economy, what happens is, some small fraction of it, will disappear, will get saved and so forth. But then a lot of it gets spent. And then, new people, get that money and they again spend most of it and so forth. So that if you inject $1 into the economy, you end up with considerably more than $1 of spending, right? So yeah, BFLB, so those sole teams that spent a lot in the first few months, even if it's only 1 or 2 teams disappearing, potentially that's quite a bit. Because the other thing about OOTP is that there's sort of a strong disincentive to save. So virtually all of the money that enters the economy gets spent. So if we were estimating that those teams were spending, say, let's say a team like that bought 25 million perfect points or something, which I think was in the ballpark of what we were estimating at this point this cycle. So one whale, let's say, is doing something like that, right? They spend 25 million perfect points. Well, what ends up happening is basically 1/10 of that gets lost to tax. The rest of it then gets respent. And so in total, this creates about 250 million points worth of spending. Now remember, we sort of worked out that There are under 1,000 teams that are even semi-active. There are basically several hundred teams. Actually, maybe that's one good way of estimating it here. If I go to the tournament rankings, let's say I just look at draft dailies for period one, and we can just ask how many teams played at least a handful of these draft dailies, right? So in period one, there are about 2,000 teams that entered kind of at least one, it looks like. But a bunch of these, maybe entered exactly one. Um, yeah, and if we ask sort of who played, one a day, so that's 30 of them. There are a few hundred teams. There are a few hundred teams that played one a day, and then you should probably add in, something about the draft weeklies. Okay, so this fits with our estimate of anywhere from a few hundred to 1,000 teams, anywhere from a few hundred to 1,000 teams that are active, right? Depending on what's going on. Rakava, yeah, that's the point out. So if you ask individual people, as you say, some people then have alts and have more than one account as well, right? But let's suppose that we're looking at 500 active teams. Okay. Well, if one team, Sol Sox, was responsible for 25 million perfect points of injection into the economy, that creates a total of about 250 million in spending by the time it finishes sort of trickling out of the economy. If we imagine there are about 500 active teams, that basically means that's 500,000 perfect points worth of spending per team just from Sol Sox alone, which is now missing. If you think that it's 1,000 teams, maybe it's more like 250,000 per team, but somewhere in there. So I think the point is a very small number of whales makes a big difference with this effect. The other change, of course, as we discussed last time, is just that the quicks are injecting fewer packs. And that has two effects. One is that there are fewer copies of the cards, so that would raise prices on cards, if there's enough money to pay for it in the system. But it also is the case, at least as we get later in the cycle, that just the quick sell value of packs is one of the big ways that points get into the system. Right? We looked last time at how packs get into the system. Well, if we think about how points get into the system, at this point, points really are coming into the system either from purchases, from quick sell value, or from achievements. There used to be a few other ways. So we used to have points coming in the system, for example, for tournament leaderboards, but now that's been switched over to Clubhouse Stars. And a few of these other things also have been switched to Clubhouse Stars, which is a sort of currency, but it just means that there are fewer points floating around the system. So I think the combination of those two is responsible for what we're seeing economically. One of the significant effects is that even though in some ways it should be easier to level a variant, when you include sort of this deflation, it's actually much more expensive right now to level a variant than it was at this time last year. It costs fewer perfect points, but it costs a greater fraction of your income, basically. So that's also worth thinking about in terms of, how that works and what your return might be and so forth. What hasn't changed basically are the purchase price of packs and the point value of achievements and so forth, right? Those have not changed. Anyway, I think that's yeah. Is there any other news or any other stuff that anyone in chat had wanted to kind of think about before we start looking at cards? I'm not seeing much, so let's start to look at some cards then. Great. Um, Let me just make sure I have the current version of the card database. Yep, okay. All right, so then let's start with Willie Ware. Actually, while I'm at it, I guess I might as well keep entering quicks, right? Then let's start it with Willie Ware. All right, there we go. Finally loaded. Okay. All right, Willie Ware. So let's see, he's listed at first base. Actually, I guess a little bit unusually doesn't play, 10 positions or something. So he's a bad but valid catcher to bail you out in drafts. Mainly plays first, plays a bad defensive second base. And then he's got a bat where, with the avoid Ks, it's a little bit better shape for the modern era, I suppose, than earlier, right? Yeah, something like that. Okay, so I suppose the main competition for this card at first base, as a 40, is going to be this Bob Unglab. And this is the 40 that kind of mostly has been running, especially versus lefties. So if we compare him with Willie Ware, the lack of power is a bit of a problem because in iron, you are still going to be able to hit some home runs. You're not kind of seeing the huge pitcher ratings often. So between the two versus lefties, Unglab should be, a bit better of a bat. Uh, and probably versus righties as well. Simply, he has kind of enough of the gap power and that power really is worth something more than zero. So if I had to pick one of the two, uh, Unglab is the one to pick. Unglab also plays a really bad second. He also plays an awful third base and right field, but he doesn't play catcher. Whereas with Willie Ware, this is a 40 overall card that can play catcher. So right now, there's one, right? There's this live Christian Vasquez. And this is actually a pretty good 40 overall catcher because he has good defense and, even a passable bat. So I think at the moment, I'd rather run Vasquez as the catcher at 40. I'd rather run Unglab as the infielder. So Willie Ware probably just gets squeezed out, so I don't think the card's going to play. But we have to remember that live cards always get re-rated. And, the odds of a 40 staying at exactly 40, actually, let me look at his stats. That's probably the way to do it. Okay, you know what? He is in 11 games. He's hitting a .115, 172 on base percentage, 192 slugging, minus 0.4 WAR. Okay, so actually, there's a good chance that Christian Vasquez is going to stay as a 40. But the bat might go down, and if the bat gets a bit weaker, that would be another reason. So basically, right now, Vasquez is going to be a better option than Willie Ware. But if the re-rate either pushes him to a higher overall or just makes the card a fair bit worse, either of those would then push him behind Ware. So I think at the moment, there's no reason to use Willie Ware. But it does seem like there's probably a path to the card becoming useful within a few weeks. And one of the things we saw last cycle is a pretty limited number of exactly 40 overall cards ever got released. It just didn't seem to be something that that happened so often, even with the tournament treasure troves. So from that point of view, I think today the card's probably an F. There just isn't room for it. But I suspect this is a card that's going to have some value between now and the end of the cycle, just because it actually occupies this unique position. So, all right. So why don't we give it a D maybe and move on? And wow, that's way longer than I wanted to spend on a card that really doesn't play, isn't it? Um, I was going to go quickly today. Um, all right. Well, let's take a different tack. So Summers. So again, low on power, which makes sense for the era. But the high avoid K. So it's again sort of this bat which isn't really an early era bat or a modern bat exactly. And getting caught in between is probably gonna mean the card just doesn't work. Because even if I compare it with exactly 44s, the problem is that this is underpowered compared with lives. So, for example, here's exactly a 44, and you're just getting more. You're getting a significantly better defensive outfielder and a bat that's in the same range. Uh, I think the one in this range that I prefer from lives would be Azakar as a 45. I'm getting even a little bit better glove and just one or two more points in the bat for it. Um, and this one doesn't seem like it's as likely that it's going to recover value or something like that in a live update. There always are going to be low iron lives, and it just seems like the power level of that's higher. So this one I think is just an F. All right, and we're on to Jake Stevens. So this looks similar to the other bat, except now we've got 20 more points of BABIP. We've got some more points of I, and we've got this 81 range. So this is really a viable infield glove. So when we add up all these things, this is a much more interesting option now. And it is at least on par with the lives. So in modern, the complete lack of power really still does hurt this card. So for example, this Javi Baez, I have a little bit ahead of it just because the 60 points of power really are worth something. And they're worth enough to make up for the difference in singles. But as soon as we go to a slightly earlier era, now Stevens is going to beat these cards. And so I think there probably is some value for him. It's probably more like a D or D plus. Maybe like a D plus. But still, the overall power level is a little bit behind the lives. So I think we're mostly still preferring lives in a lot of these formats to Stevens. And remember that Javi Baez here, because he's listed as qualified at these positions, he also is going to play every field position but catcher in a tournament. So, in other words, he profiles even a little bit better at third, probably than he does at second. Whereas for Stevens, if you're going to run the card, then probably, yeah, third maybe is again where he profiles best too, and a little bit better versus lefties. Although versus lefties, you have the problem that you run into a card like this Bill Allman, which really is just clearly better versus lefties and a similar shape. So it's still going to win both in modern eras, and then as you go back, that BABIP's going to be dominant versus lefties in an early era. So I'd much rather have Allman plus save the 8 points in a cap. All right, what we got next then is Bill Powell, right? Yeah. Where's Powell? Yeah, there he is. Okay. All right, Bill Powell. So we're up to full iron. Uh, so we've got a starting pitcher with a flat profile. I know the color scheme kind of exaggerates it. You know, that 69 is yellow. If it were 70, it would be this green color, and it would be an even more clearly flat profile. But there's a reasonably flat profile. It's a lefty with tiny splits, and we haven't had a lot of lefties that are viable in iron so far. So if a couple cards like this get in, it makes the verse left side of platoons a lot more interesting. So it would be nice to have a few cards like this available. There are a couple. There's the live JP Sears has been playable. I've seen some people playing Morton is probably doable. All right. So where does this rank? Well, the main difference is the stamina and this 76 stamina. And it still is the case that basically every historical player has more stamina than the lives. We know that the way Perfect Team calculates overall rating, stamina is a significant component. So in order to get him to throw another inning, we know he's significantly underpowered compared with the lives. And the only question is at what point power creep catches up enough that these guys start playing. But it's just not going to be yet. For example, here's a comparable lefty in Jose Suarez. Okay, he's splittier, but he's just better versus right, and he's better versus left by a lot. He's better versus right by a little. And the cost is he only has the 52 stamina. But as long as you're going to think about running a 13th pitcher anyway, just all of the pitchers of this shape, well, or really of any shape, all of the pitchers are just behind lives of the same shape. And after a month of power creep, we haven't caught up to it yet. So, basically all of these are going to be Fs or F minuses. Okay, is this an F or an F minus? Let's see. Would he play low iron? No, he wouldn't really play low iron easily either. Let's just give it an F because there is the stamina, so it is in that sense kind of the best of its shape. Yeah, so let's go ahead and give it an F, but yeah, we're just not yet at the point that this is going to work, is what it looks like. All right, Romy Fields. So we've had a little more luck with the position players. Okay, so he's listed as a two-way player. Okay, no, but the pitching ratings really aren't helpful. So this is really just second base, right field. And that's interesting. Okay, so the bat looks good for 54 overall. And I guess the reason the bat looks so good is basically because although he's listed at second base, this is a horrendous defensive second baseman. So this card cannot play second base with the 48 range and the 41 turn double play, and yeah, this is not a second baseman. It's probably not really a right fielder either, and I think that's where we're going to run into trouble. Yeah, so he has to be a DH, but now if this card's a DH, there's just not enough, even with this contact and even with this eye, he still isn't getting on base enough to win. You're gonna lose to a card like Denny Doyle, Jesus Alou, the So Taguchi that we saw. So modern era, just this really zero for power kind of isn't going to work. The other thing we should do is we should be running the card in an early era to see if it's better. And I guess right now I don't think there is a really early era tournament, right? He's got a Candy Jim Cup. Yeah, when we get to Candy Jim, we'll have similar issues. But Candy Jim, also just is underpowered and kind of, I guess it has mission value, but it doesn't have a lot of play value, is what it looks like. I do like that the pitching ratings are listed here in the card shop, though. That's a big improvement. Um, okay, yeah. So if I run in an early era, no, then the card still doesn't work because now we're going to be running into a bat like uh, this Donovan Solano. It's just a much bigger bat versus lefties, and also iron eligible. The Adalberto Mondesi, who even has enough shape that you can run him modern, but this is also going to be a bigger early era bat. All right, so yeah, iron Rome, we don't play that. All right, how about Jackie? We got our first Jackie. So iron Jackie. Let's see. Okay, so it's a Dodgers Jackie listed at third, plays first, second, third, left, but doesn't play short in this version. And the bat's a fair bit better versus left and is sort of a modern era shape. So, all right, we've added a fair number of points to kind of make this one playable, right? Let's see where this one's going to rank. Just by eye, this looks like at a minimum, this should be a really strong third baseman versus lefties. But let's see what the model says. Okay, yeah, the model has something similar. So the model also agrees that this is going to be your best infield bat versus lefties. Versus righties, it's a fair bit weaker. So how valuable this card is really going to come down to how many lefties there are. The thing is that there hasn't really been a good multi-position option. So even in full iron at the moment, I've been running this Bill Allman as my sort of verse left backup infielder. And Jackie clearly clobbers that card. It's a better bat versus left, but it's also a more viable bat versus right. And the defense, especially at third, is going to be really good. So there's clearly a good reason to have this card versus lefties. Okay, versus righties, it doesn't seem to work as well. So I think the best spot for Jackie is going to be either at second or third. The bat's not quite good enough to put him in left or certainly first or something like that. You do want him to start at left, so he should be part of your iron build. How valuable a part really depends on how many lefties we get. If we get up to 3 or 4 lefties at some point in the near future in iron, then this is a pretty important card. If we're still seeing 4 to 4.5 righties in the rotation, which is I think what I've seen most recently, then this is still a good backup and it's still a card that should be in your build, but it's not all that important. So if it were lefty dominated, this card's an A. If it's very righty dominated like now, it's probably more like a C. So yeah, maybe give it about a B. This is definitely a useful card. This definitely should be in your iron build. One other consideration here is the verse right bat is at least close enough that if you think about what a level 5 version of this looks like, you might be able to play him both ways over base versions. So that's another way in which there's a big difference between this card and Alman. Alman, even at level 5, I can show you what that looks like, but Alman, even at level 5, really is unplayable versus righties. The glove's fine, but is unplayable versus righties. Jackie can play versus righties at level 5, or at least is close enough that you're not killing yourself doing it. All right, what do we got next? Frank Warfield. All right. So we had a really good silver last time. This is a similar shape. Again, it's this complete zero power shape, but There's also quite a bit less in the bat here than some of the ones we looked at before. So better defensively at second, but even for iron, this is a really weak bat, and the glove's not going to be good enough to make up for it. This really isn't a strong shortstop glove or anything like that. And as we saw in early eras, you're still competing with cards like Mondesi and Solano in addition to everything else. So it's certainly not an F minus. That this beats all the low irons because there is enough in the bat. Uh, the card that it actually ends up fairly similar to is this Harry Steinfeld, in terms of like overall power level. And that's a card that's not quite in the meta. But now there's a problem with this Warfield, which is this is a card that you need clubhouse stars for. Um, and as a tournament reward, you don't want to release a card that's just unplayable from the get-go. Your 40 clubhouse stars is the equivalent of, or the packs, is the equivalent of 5 gold packs, right? Or, a fair number of standard packs, but it's the equivalent of, say, 5 gold packs, right? So why would you ever buy Warfield? And this is where I'm now puzzled, because if you look at Warfield, you can see that you can buy him for 8,000 perfect points, and one sold for, a little over 5,000. And that's just nuts. Like, you could directly, you don't even have to take any risk to do it. I mean, you should do it with standard packs, they're more valuable, fine. But you could take zero risk. You could take those 40 clubhouse stars, buy 5 gold packs, quick sell every card you get out of those gold packs, and you will return a little bit over 5,000 perfect points, minimum. If you spend 40 clubhouse stars, buy Warfield and sell them for 55.55, after the 10% tax, you get 5,000. So, yeah. Um, this is a card that, the card's an F, but there should be no copies of this card in the game uh, without some kind of enormous mission value. And nobody should be pulling one of these and trying to sell him for 8,000 perfect points. It doesn't work. You know, yeah, there are plenty of things that you could do that would be more efficient than that. For 125 clubhouse stars, you can get a perfect pack, and that will always be worth a quick sell value of at least 20K. That's also much more efficient than doing this. So I could I can always understand getting a card if it fits a theme team or it's a favorite player of yours or something like that. I do not understand buying this card and then selling him at this price. Nor do I understand buying him actually even at this price. So there should be no copies of this card that exist. Um, okay, well, let's go on then to bronzes. See how we do there. So we've had some petways in the past that were really good shapes for perfect team. So this one, so this is not as good of a defensive catcher as the bronze petways we've had in the past, I suppose. So overall, not as good of a catcher defensively. And then we have the same bat that kind of is this, zero shape. But the problem is this is still, so in modern era, this is crushed for all the reasons we had seen. But in early eras, now this card also is losing out basically because the bat's not good enough. Uh, and there are a couple of extreme, BABIP, sorry, this is that's I pulled up the wrong one. But there are a couple of extreme sort of BABIP type bats in there, which are going to do better in an early era as well. This is Kinslow the one I'm thinking of? No, who am I? All right, I'm gonna have to go check the model. These are not the ones I was trying to pull up, but I know there are some. Uh, who is it that I'm thinking of? All right, I'll give up and run the model. This is what I get for, taking a couple weeks off, right? Just lose all the player pool knowledge. Okay, that's wrong. Here you go. So here's an example of, sort of a BABIP catcher that's then just going to clobber him in an early era. Um, yeah, so this Petway just is kind of going to be completely unplayable then. So modern, it's completely unplayable. Early era, yeah, it's still pretty unplayable. Um, yeah, it's probably just an F minus. All right. How about Dink? So we have a mission, Dink. The mission structure here. So if we look at the missions, a lot of these were ones that couldn't be completed with existing cards. So many of them needed new cards. Um, so Dink, it looks like you only have to complete. Okay, so Dink you have to complete 4 missions. So you get them for different checkpoints, basically. Uh, yeah, okay. And then at 6 missions you get this Pop Lloyd. At 8 missions you get Easterling. Yeah, you get Roy Parnell. Sorry, you get Roy Parnell at 10. And then Page is needs all 14. All right, so Dink is sort of the first of these. All right, so Dink's the first of these. So if we look at the value here, so this is an early era shape bat, but you notice the power is up to more like 50, and that makes him more viable. And if this were on par with those irons we looked at, then it just makes a lot of sense to play him. The problem is this is now a full bronze. And as a full bronze, we're again just behind the overall power level of the cards. So although this is a mission reward and you're going to be putting a lot of effort into getting it, it really isn't going to play anywhere in Modern. Having said that, this is the best bat for a really early era catcher because now he has sort of everything but the power, and the fact he's not a good defensive catcher isn't really hurting him much. So there's a narrow path to the card being viable. I guess it's a D minus. There is that one 1927 bronze, but I guess it's a cap, and so you're not going to spend on a catcher there, right? But so there's some narrow pathway to using the card. But overall, it's probably not very useful. It is interesting though that he's selling in the 20K range. And I'm really surprised by that, in part because if you're buying the card, sometimes the mission structures just require you to lock mission rewards so you can buy them. But here they don't. So here you get a card that's not worth 20K for finishing the mission, but also if you buy him instead of finishing the mission, you still have to finish the missions to get the higher rewards. So I'm again sort of surprised at the decision making, but it's clear if you look at the market, a bunch of people disagree with me. So fair enough. And I don't know whether he, should or shouldn't be sold, right? Uh, that depends a little bit if you think that there's going to be a future mission where he also does have mission value. But if you had no mission value, yeah, I think you probably could just sell it. Um, all right, well, why don't we go on then? So yeah, so Dizzy. Uh, there's no way this is going to work, right? We've got a right-handed starter that is just going to be smoked by lefties, and there's no real redeeming feature to that, right? Or what am I missing? All right. Well, let me run the model and see what I'm missing here. Hmm. All right. Well, model likes him a lot better than I do by eye. So let me see if I can figure out why. So yeah, what the model is basically saying is that there are enough righties that the value of this card against righties makes him viable. And that this is a card that you can put in, maybe toward the back end of your rotation, especially if you run an opener. But that even it does agree the lefties are going to clobber him. But it still thinks that you're going to see enough righties, especially if you're seeing only 13 hitters. So, one fewer platoon. It thinks you're going to see enough righties that there is a reason to use the card. I tend not to agree. I think regardless of what the model says. So, Mr. Black, a lot of players in bronze squad 5+ righties. You mean batters? Is that right? Yeah. So if that's the case, if you're hitting that many righties, then yeah, this is going to be a pretty good card. Um, you know, and because the thing is, if you look at the other cards that he's competing with, some of the other cards that clobber righties are even worse against lefties, right? Like this Don Asa. This card is even better against righties, but doesn't even have that home run suppression against lefties, for example. Um, or Wayne Simpson is in there. Um, so he has sort of PBAB versus lefties, but nothing else. Art Fromm, same kind of thing, right? So what this says is of these very splitty cards, this is probably, you know, this is probably semi-viable. So the model wants to kind of give this one, like a C or D. I really think he's completely unplayable. Let's make it a D and move on. But then there's a related discussion because the other card that has the same sort of shape is the next one I discussed, this String Bean Williams. String Bean is not quite as good against righties, but is that little bit better against lefties because he also has more control. Uh, and I guess he also has a tiny bit of a bat, so if your pitcher's hitting, maybe get a little something out of it. So in general, I really like that all of these Negro League cards from this era do have very little power. I think it gives them a distinctive shape, and it's all the more reason that I wish we had more early era tournaments where these cards become interesting. I think that's a fun thing to do with the game engine. But of the two, then, String Bean's that little bit more balanced. So I think if you have to pick one, this is the one that's more like a C. And again, full disclosure for both of these, if I just hand you the model numbers, the model will put these 1 to 2 letter grades higher. The model thinks you can find a way to make both work. And yeah, B-Phil B, if you can make it work with an opener, if you can get him in against the righties, these guys will get righties out. One other thing to consider with a card like this, especially if you conclude it only works with an opener, that means a card like this is either a starter or unplayable. Because if you ever put a card like this late enough in the game when everyone's going to pinch hit, then you are just going to see lefties in any situation with even moderate leverage. and now the card is just crushed. So I think you have to think about this as a starter, ideally with an opener, where you're just trying to get as much righties anyway. Um, yeah, Mr. Bai, that's another way to think about it. Pub Stomper card is a good way to think about it. And yeah, in a weekly tournament, you're eventually going to run into a well enough constructed team that there will be lefties and they will be aware of how to set opener lineups, and you won't have a great way, you know, there's probably a way to still micro around it with a card like this. There are other tricks you can come up with. Uh, I don't really actively micro tournaments at this point. So for me, I'm just not going to touch the card, I think. But, you know, it might be worth, say, running it with an opener and quicks and just accepting that, some of the time the openers don't work and you lose. I'm not sure that's a crazy idea. Um, all right. Oh, and we got another Jackie. And this Jackie I like because I pulled a couple of them and I was somehow getting 20K for bronzes, which means I sold both of mine. But hey, I can rebuy it for, 40 cents on the dollar. All right. Independent of the mission structure, though, as for the quality of the card, so let's see. It looks like second base now is the better shape here. The arm's not quite as good for third. He has the 89 turn double play. So this probably wants to be a second baseman. And really only versus righties, because remember that in bronze we have fill-ins, we have Pump C Green. So we have cards where any sort of platoon, you always want to find platoon partners in the infield because of how good those cards are. Versus right, I do have this as the top base second baseman. And he's only a little bit ahead in base of Glenn Beckert. And that matters because if you're trying to run 13, so this Beckert is much more viable as a two-way option than Jackie would be. I still think you probably do want a platoon, just as they're saying, because of how good these versus lefty infielders are. And so if you're going to platoon, then I'd rather run Jackie. If you're going to run a two-way card, I'd rather run Beckert. Beckert also only plays second, but Linz and Green play a bunch of positions. So yeah, I guess with that in mind, there's definitely room for this card on a bronze roster. I guess in my case, I actually went and got a variant version of Beckert, which means I'm not going to try to upgrade to Jackie. It sort of makes sense to skip because my variant version of Beckert is still going to be better than a base version of Jackie. But as a base, this is certainly a card to start in bronze, and bronze is very right-handed, so this is actually not a bad swing card. If you want to commit to the verse righty thing and run fewer of the verse lefty options, having this card on your roster as a viable backup third baseman and so forth is useful as well. And as a bench player, this is a good base runner also. I think there's some good value for it. I think it's probably something like a B. I think you want to start him against the dominant side, but it's not the best two-way card, so you're always going to be making some sacrifices to do it. So it's a pretty well-balanced card then. All right, and then we got Jerry Benjamin. So let's see. So another card that we've seen kind of, silver versions of. The 97 range is definitely competitive here because this is a real bat, and this bat will do fine in early eras as well. The other thing that's kind of been missing in the bronze meta, we've mostly been missing cards that you really want to run on both sides. There's maybe one. So the one that I have been running has been this Norris Hopper. I've been willing to run both sides, but Benjamin now. So with the lower void K in modern, I have Hopper slightly ahead of Benjamin. As soon as you get to an even slightly earlier era, then Benjamin's gonna start to win and be even stronger. But you can also play both. I think I'm going to just run Benjamin in center. I'm going to run Hopper in a corner. And now I have two-way outfielders, which gives me more of a chance to play some of the splitty infielders and platoon there. So I think this is a card that you really do want in your lineup somewhere. This also, so I have him versus right as the best center fielder, but also even the best left fielder. Yeah, even as the best left fielder versus righties in bronze. In right, I have him a little behind Homer Smoot VR. And, he's not the best on both sides, but he certainly is viable. And it's hard enough to find two-way cards that I think this is just a pretty important card to have if you're playing bronze. So this one, I think, is a pretty clear A. He's not playing up, so he's not going to be an S, but this feels like a pretty important one. And actually, you know what? No, I'm too disciplined to pay 3,700 points for a bronze card. But I will definitely get this card at some point, even if I'm not doing the other missions yet. All right, we're on to silver then. Trying to at least make good time, right? Not sure how well we're doing, but we can pretend. All right, Robert Hudspeth. Okay, so this is a bit of a unique bat compared with the ones we've seen because this bat does have power. That's the good news. Uh, the bad news is it just looks really underpowered compared with the bats that we've seen. This is a first baseman. It's a VR first baseman. I am really confused. So, for example, we just had this. We just had this Trey Morgan. This is just a much bigger bat. That's also a versus righty first baseman and is also low silver. So, yeah, I think this one's just an F minus. Clearly, actually, we had one earlier that we forgot too. Yep. So clearly, what this means is that Spore just made one of the classic mistakes you're not allowed to. He forgot about Trey. All right, Poindexter Williams. All right, so bad defensive catcher. So my model is always going to hate these bad defensive catchers, kind of independent of everything else. So my model is always going to struggle to be interested here. Let's ignore that for the moment and let's just ask, is it a good bat for a catcher if you want to run a more offensive catcher? So here, yeah, or I could even run my model in an earlier era, I suppose, if we wanted to compare it that way. Let's see. Okay, yeah, this is still just not that big of a bat, is it? So, once you're looking at silver, we've got like a Red Wilson, we've got Bubbles, we've even got, cards like the Dink that we saw. Okay, so I always end up giving a card like this an F just because of the glove, but I think it is actually just objectively behind even the bat first catchers. So I think there's less of a bias to the model here than for some of the others. All right. Barney. So, well, the most interesting thing here is we have a lefty with reverse splits. So, if nothing else, this is the kind of shape that you'd like to see from an opener. So there should be some kind of value there. It's just hard to find lefties, that survive against righties. But we did have one in full silver come in recently, this Randy Wolf, kind of as a lefty that works against righties. And Barney has a lot fewer points than that, which is basically the problem. So shape-wise, this is great, but the card's just incredibly underpowered compared with, anything that's come out recently. I think for the reverse splits, just for that alone, probably there would be room for this card in bronze. So it's not an F minus, it's just an F, but it's just woefully underpowered. I'm kind of puzzled by this. This looks a lot like the bronzes that we were looking at. All right, Silver Jackie. Well, we're certainly getting the blue colors, so that's starting to be an indication that the verse left bat here should be pretty strong. So this is first base only. Yes, actually first base only, which is weird. Because I thought the whole idea was that we were taking positions basically if you've played that position, almost at all, within a few year period around it, you were getting eligibility, right? So Jackie, I guess, did only play first in 1947, but then in 48 he played second and third as well and so forth. So that's weird. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's weird. But all right. So that is going to mean that it's really only the bat that we're getting. Um, but now that's going to break the card, isn't it? Because now the problem is the VR bat isn't good enough, bat only. But VL, you've got to compare it with this David Segui, who, is playing up into low diamond in some builds. So, yeah. So unfortunately, then Jackie just gets squeezed out because of positional eligibility. Even though it's a really good bat, it's not as good as Segui, and it's a first base only kind of bat. So if you're behind Segui and you're behind a card like, Rennie Stinnett or, Pumpsy Green or, the really splitty ones, then that's it. You just don't play. Um, and yeah, yeah, I think there's no other because this is also behind some others. If you're really just thinking about as a DH or something, now you're behind several others. This Bill Robinson, probably also is a bigger bat and so forth in full silver. Lou Piniella. Okay, then I guess that's the answer. So this one really is hurt by the positional flexibility. If I were allowed to play this card at second based on his 1948 season, or if I were allowed to play him at short based on the Negro League seasons he had prior to playing for the Dodgers in 47, either of those make this a really strong card. Uh, but it's just that defensive value is wasted at first base. All right, Carl Glass. Um, is, Okay. This one's just missing a lot of points, right? Like, compare this to the Shane Smith that just came out or something, and it's just, you know, where did all the points go? Um, yeah, this is just an F minus. It's missing all the points. Um, okay. Pop Lloyd. So we have our next mission card. So this is interesting. We have a Pop Lloyd all the way down to a silver. In the past, we've often seen Pop Lloyd instead as basically a meta league card for a while on release. So, all right, this is not as good, of course, as those. The bat is really good versus right. So it's really a bat first, probably middle infielder with the 87 range. But I guess you could play third probably. Yeah, probably short or third would be the best spots. And it's a little bit splitty, but it's still a pretty right-handed meta, so that's okay. And this should be a really strong card versus right. So the other thing that helps, the card that I've been playing versus right in a position like this is this Dick McAuliffe. This is a Clubhouse Shop card, which means there is no variant version of it. And that helps because there's going to be no variant version of Pop Lloyd as a mission card either. But it means that the card he's replacing also doesn't have a variant. So yeah, I've got Lloyd versus right as best shortstop option, best, yeah, also I guess best at third, maybe even by a little bit more than short. So this says that's the better place. Also the best versus right second base option. So plenty of room for him to play. Does he play up? Actually, there's a little bit of a hole. Let me check, because it's actually possible that he's going to play up just just because there's been a bit of a hole in the meta. It's mainly been these live mission rewards, and so they're a bit behind in Power Creep now. They're a month old. So it's possible that he'll play. Well, I guess the low gold, because it's an early era, it's a good shape for the bat as well. So I think at least for the 1919 low gold, I'm going to want to play him. Yeah, you know what? I think I'm going to want to play this card probably at third. I think I'm going to want to play him at, yeah, in third and short even in full gold. Yeah, I think both of them. Okay, so then even though Pop is fairly splitty, so you really don't want to play him versus lefties. There aren't a ton of lefties in silver. Gold, there are more. And, it's at least survivable as a backup versus lefties because the glove is okay. The bat's not a complete zero. Yeah, so I think even though he's splitty, I think this is at least an S. Yeah, maybe it's even just an S plus the way things have come out this year. I mean, it's one of the stronger cards that we've seen. And it really does push the meta. And it's winning at multiple positions, so it's going to stick around for a while. Yeah, I think this should be an S plus. All right, so then Pop is one of the ones to focus on getting. And it looks like you can buy him directly as a mission card. There hasn't been a sale yet. I still would think if you're planning on doing the missions at some point, it's silly to buy a card like Pop because to get to get kind of the later mission rewards, you're going to get Pop along the way anyway. So I probably would instead just think about as finishing the missions that feed into him. And you need, yeah, okay, 6 out of, I guess, the 10 cheapest, basically, to do this. Okay. All right, so that's Pop. What do we got next here? Newt. 102 range, so love the glove. Uh, the bat's not going to be as good as Pop's. And I guess actually, you already know from the discussion we just had that I've got this card a fair bit behind Pop, basically because of the bat. The glove is certainly useful. The thing is, this 102 range isn't really unprecedented. You have a card like this Phil Linz that has 105 range as well. So there's even a bronze out there that has this kind of range and is more useful in roster building. So Newt just with that bat is not going to work. Um, all right. How about Leroy Matlock? So let's see. Lefty with only slight split. So that's good because of how desperate we've been to find some lefties. That certainly makes sense. Um, but like the others we just saw, this is just short on points. Compare it to a card like the Shane Smith we saw, or that sort of thing. It's just short on points. Um, as an example of a card which really hasn't been in the silver meta all that much, there's this Clubhouse Shop one, this Perez. But this is a lefty that just has more of everything and is a low silver and still isn't in the meta. So I think this one's just going to come up short. All right, and finally we've got Orville Singer, another Clubhouse Shop card. So a little better versus lefty, but this is actually pretty balanced. I think the splits are a little exaggerated by the color difference, if anything. Uh, Plays both middle infield and outfield, so a useful utility guy. But there's also been a little bit of a hole in just sort of silver outfield. This is kind of a funny one. Um, there are a lot of very splitty cards in outfield and silver right now. This is behind all of the splitty cards both ways. So the Chandler Simpson that came out from the Future Legends set is basically just winning. Um, this isn't as good as Simpson, but I have him. So, for example, in right field, I have Singer 7th VR, I have him 4th VL, but then I have him second behind Chandler Simpson as a two-way card because almost all of the others are very splitty and this one isn't. Um, okay, Red, your server quick didn't like which one? Didn't like Matlock or didn't like Singer? Sorry. Uh, I wasn't sure which one you were. Didn't like Singer. Okay. Um, yeah. So I think the issue is if you have a balanced mix of lefties and righties, I think you're going to get enough out of Singer that he's good for roster building because he's one of the only outfielders that plays both ways. And if you're trying to run only 13 position players, that means you have three non-catcher backups, and so that means you're desperate to find something like this, right? Um, but he's going to be behind all of the one-way players. So if, for example, you expected to basically see righties, then I don't think you'd want to run the two-way player, right? Um, oh, hey, good morning, D Block. Actually, this is good timing because if you're now awake and we're going to stream, then I'm done. I can just raid into you. Uh, yeah. So we do have Randy Wolf also as a lefty that kind of just came in. And so that's at least one lefty that you are going to have to deal with. I think the more lefties you have to deal with, the more Singer is going to be useful as the two-way player. So this is a card I did actually spend the stars on to grab from the shop, in part because he's also useful in some of these early era tournaments, but just because it just sort of made the roster building work a little bit better. So in something like a silver and gold cap, this ended up kind of in the right range where I need two-way players and I want something a little bit cheaper than the golds, and he's actually pretty close to that level, for example. So yeah, I think this card has some real value. It's not the best VR or the best VL, so I really don't think it's an A, but I think it's a solid B, and I think it has sort of more value just because of what's missing in the meta, maybe than the actual power level of the card. So one or two good two-way outfielders, or even just more two-way players at other positions would hurt the value of Singer. But right now he fits the meta, it looks like. Um, so yeah, that one probably is useful. All right, Padron. Wait, Cavacom stayed up too late. Well, unless you were going to stream Cava, then I can raid into you, and then you could raid into D Block. We can figure something out. Uh, let's see. All right, Padron. So what do we have? We have a starting pitcher. So lefty, pretty splitty, but this looks like the ones we saw before, and it's just, you know, missing a lot of points. You compared this with a card like Shane Smith, and there's just more points there. So yeah, this doesn't play in gold. This doesn't play in. It's just an F minus. And these are also going to be problems. So one of the things to think about with the clubhouse shop, there have been two big changes in sort of how the clubhouse shop was put together. So let's think about how tournament rewards used to work. You know, Initially, or at least at the point I started playing the game, each tournament had a specific reward. So a specific card from the pool that was assigned to it. You knew that if you won the tournament, you got this perfect. If you were second, you got, this diamond and so forth. Um, and this would mean that a tournament where the reward was unplayable. So look, anytime you put a set together, some cards are going to be better than others. And I think it's also the case that, Spore is in a little bit of a bind because, you know, so for one thing, they don't tell them how the game engine works. They clearly don't have a perfect model or something, right? So they're doing the best without a perfect model. Still puzzling to me that they don't, given that they own the game engine, but they're doing the best with an imperfect model, and that always means that you're going to miss in some direction or another when you try to get the power level of cards, and I understand that. So the same thing would happen that, it might be the case that, some rewards were better than others. So if a tournament just all had bad rewards, it would be tough for it to fill. Or alternatively, we ended up in kind of the funny situation where, say, you could get the best gold reward or an awful low diamond reward, and then people would actually just prefer to lose and get the gold. Um, the idea of choice packs improved the situation in the sense that it was always better to get sort of a better choice pack. But it comes at the cost that you essentially run through your pool quicker, right? In other words, if you put together, 10 rewards at a given level, some of the 10 are going to be awful, some of them are going to be good, but it means that you don't have to win 10 tournaments to get the good ones. You can get the good ones by winning two or three tournaments. Uh, and so you then have to kind of cycle through the pool more quickly, right? Um, with the clubhouse shop, we've now so that's why when you'd have a new tournament batch, it would only last a couple of weeks, right? So it would only last a couple of weeks, and then At that point, everyone would have all the competitive cards. So to further prop up the value, you could use mission value to make the other cards desirable. And then eventually, when the mission value was exhausted, you have to move on and get a new tournament batch. With the Clubhouse shop, the idea of releasing tournament cards, regularly in connection with everything else makes sense. But I think they haven't figured out two pacing problems. Okay, so the first is, uh, let's say you were focused on gold in PT25. You know, if you were focused on gold in PT25, when you win tournaments, you wouldn't only win gold cards. If you won weeklies, you'd win perfects. But in general, if you were playing tournaments, you'd hit the entire range from, your silver or your bronze and silver tournament pack up to your high diamond. So that means you weren't winning a gold reward every time you got rewards. But in PT26, the way the Clubhouse shop works, just as variants let you specialize, and I think that creates a problem segmenting the game. The Clubhouse shop further lets you specialize. In other words, if I'm playing gold, I never need to win a diamond card from a tournament, just ever. No matter how good the diamond cards are, I can simply ignore the diamond cards, right? And I can mostly ignore the silver cards. Maybe sometimes a silver card could be so strong that it plays in gold, and then I would buy it. But what it means is I'm using my resources on even fewer. In other words, let's imagine that you're a player that is choosing to focus on gold in PT26, right? Well, if we look at what's in the Clubhouse shop, let's suppose that every single card is an important meta card at the time it comes out, which is probably not true. There have been 6 gold cards that came out. On release, they will reach 100 Clubhouse stars. So if I were able to earn, basically a little over 100 Clubhouse stars per week, I can have every single gold card that is ever relevant in the tournament shop, and I don't need the rest of my stars, right? So what it means is you run through these very quickly. If you're playing gold and you win one weekly, that one weekly at this point will buy you every single tournament gold card that has been released the entire cycle. And you're also getting some Clubhouse stars for things like league play and other things where it's even that little bit easier to find those 600 stars a month into the game. So what that means is the only way this works then is if sort of there are more of these and more of them are viable. Because now let's say, as it comes out, well, not all of them are really viable. If you look at the gold cards, Padron is just unplayable. Benintendi's good. Hamels wasn't very good. Seeger was awful. Morales was okay. Bando was sort of awful. So really 200 or 300 stars would be enough to get you everything you wanted the whole cycle, basically. And the more cards sort of end up not being viable, the worse that gets. And at the same time, we're on track to have a lot fewer. If we think about last cycle, there were, I guess, around 50 perfects, for example. But there were actually a lot more, say, silver and bronzes than perfects, right? In these tournament packs. There were more low diamonds than perfects. There were more high diamonds than perfects. To this point in the cycle, we have had 2 low diamonds released. We've had 5 perfects released. So we're on pace over the course of the cycle to only have 25 perfects released for the whole cycle, right? And that means they all need, basically the only way this even comes close to working is if every single card that hits the Clubhouse shop is overpowered to the point that you need it, right? That's the problem. Yes, I'm sort of reading the chat. Well, if too many are viable, you say playing casually is impossible. But if variants are viable, playing casually is impossible too. And we're already sort of past that point. You know, that's the way the game's gone. But I think they have to be viable. Um, yeah, and you could say you're gonna have to live with CS going into packs, but then that also kind of breaks the economic side of the game, right? Well, packable perfects are going to be cheaper simply because there isn't as much money in the system. You know, as we're sort of calculating, a little bit earlier in the stream, the loss of a single whale basically cost everybody 300,000 to 500,000 perfect points at this point in the cycle. Um, but yeah, if the it basically means that I don't understand the combination of making it possible to segment, but then having there be many fewer tournament cards. And yeah, I don't see how that's going to work. I suspect the direction that they're intending to go with this is that they're pretty soon going to start releasing, say, a variant version of the gold clubhouse shop card for 5 times the price or 10 times the price or something like that. Uh, well, Claydog, it's not they said something, it's that they've made it clear that they're doing a release so far. They're doing a release every 2 weeks to update it. That's what we should expect. And those releases typically are about the size the release we have here. But then the problem is if you look at the cards that have come out so far, they're not cards you want. You know, Padron is not releasable basically, right? You should never buy Padron. You should never buy Warfield and so forth. So yeah, I think that's going to be the idea. Is they'll just try to get you to use more stars for the variant version or something. Um, I think that's going to be the idea. But no, but Clay Dog, it's not that they're ones you would never pick in a pack, because the problem is if these are, I would never pick. With this few tournament cards, I would just have a copy of every card in the game. How many tournaments do you have to play? How many tournaments do you have to play to have been able to pick up all 6 gold tournament cards by 5.5 weeks into the game? You know, it's not a lot. So the answer is I'd pick all these out of packs because I would just pick everything. I'd have many more packs than cards. No, Quaydog, I'm not just talking about gold. I'm saying I would have, well, the truth is, if I wanted to buy every card in the clubhouse shop, I could. I'm earning stars. I am currently earning stars at a rate which is higher than the rate needed to buy every single card on release. Now, I'm not buying every single card on release. I haven't bought most of these because the cards just aren't very good, you know. So even if I have the points to buy everything on release, I'm wasting them on the cards as released. Yeah. The other thing, yeah, well, if the card only has mission value, that's kind of a problem, right? Um, yeah, I've spent a bunch of clubhouse stars on packs, and I guess as you can see, I've saved some for a rainy day or whatever. But even having clubhouse stars to burn, I think I'd be lighting them on fire buying what's currently in the shop. You know, Well, cards admissions will be sellable. Um, and you can see kind of what that price ends up being. Now, for the cards and missions to be sellable, the mission rewards have to be good also. And that's been an issue for some of the missions as well. You know. But more generally, the point is if you're only going to release if you're only going to release basically one perfect every 2 weeks, and then every time you release a perfect which isn't a good card, you're basically making people wait a month between getting a reward card that helps them in the league. And that just feels like a mistake from a game design point of view. Um, yeah, so that's what I'm saying. We have a much smaller release size than in the past. We have a much smaller release size, and then yeah, yeah. So look, I do think it's the case that the game works best when I think it works. I think the game works best when the meta cards are a mixture of packable things which you can buy just using resources, mission rewards which require you to put some effort into collecting a variety of different cards, and tournament rewards which require you to have uh, success playing the game independent of what you're spending. You know, to me, the ideal meta, like at any given time for the league, would be about a third of each of them. Um, you know, well, yeah, D-Block. I think that's the problem is they still don't have a model. Look, there's I can't imagine that they took the time to design a card for Juan Padron and said, I want to design a card which is unplayably bad. There's just no reason you would ever do that, you know? Like you wouldn't intentionally do that. So it's obviously a miss. Uh, but also, I think they're, you know, in the card design, it does seem clear that there's an intent to make sure that you miss weak instead of miss strong. And I can understand why, because we've had a few cards in the past where they miss strong, and then they make it very difficult to release new cards into the meta, and sort of celebrate those players. Utley as a live mission reward last time basically killed the ability to release other second basemen for quite a while, right? Um, yeah. So, you know, so that's I think part of the problem. Yeah, well, Clay Dog, look, the whole idea of variance is to basically kill off the free to play community, right? That's already the intent. Uh, I wish it weren't. I'm a free to play player. I think killing that community basically kills the game when you successfully kill that community. The reason we do streams like this is to help that community try to figure out what they should and shouldn't spend the limited resources on. But clearly the intent of making it so that you can pour an unsustainable amount of resources not just into the league but into every single tournament level is to make it so that people are forced to put an unsustainable amount of resources in to compete. That's the design. Um, so you know, I don't think you can be surprised that they're doing things that are bad if you're free to play. Um, but I also don't think this is one of them. I don't think, you know, the reason you release a card is you get to tell a fun story, you get to like, honor the history of baseball and the player and so forth. I think the intent of choosing to put out Juan Padron is, oh, this is a player with an interesting story, and we want people to kind of engage with the player and the story and see this. And that doesn't happen if you release a card, that is unplayable. So I don't think that was the intent. But I am really puzzled because, as I was saying, you don't really need a model to realize that it's a problem. You can take you can take a card like Padron, just look at this card versus righties, right? Compare it to, a card like the Shane Smith you just released. You don't really need a model to kind of see that Padron's way behind, right? You don't need a model to see that you just released a lefty in Matlack and that this lefty is basically, I mean, it's a PTCS reward, so it should be strong, but this is just Padron with a lot more points. So clearly this card is much, much better than Padron. So the problem is you don't need a model to do that. Here's, this Ray Sadecki, right? Um, there are cards that have this kind of shape, and you don't need a model to see that they're way ahead. You can just compare and like bigger number good kind of thing, right? So yeah, well yeah, Claydog, that's right. So the if you have an unplayable card, you should never pick it to sell it because you can't, you get more points from buying the packs. Um, so I think that's right. Um, yeah. Anyway, but yeah, that's the situation, right? Well, I think the clubhouse shop cards, not even they should at least be a D. The problem is for any clubhouse shop card, it costs you the equivalent of a lot of points. If I spend 100 clubhouse stars on Padron, I could get most of a perfect pack for that. I could get, over 40 standard packs for that and so forth, right? So in order for it to be a sensible thing, it has to be worth more than that floor or it's a useless card. So the only way to avoid that if you're going to release a weak clubhouse shop card, if you're going to release a weak clubhouse shop card, you basically need to reduce the price, right? Otherwise it just doesn't work. Yeah, so Zoom, they all eventually get sent to YouTube, but I think Twitch also archives them for some period of time. So both should be available. I'm looking right now to kind of check, just because I'm realizing the one from 2 weeks ago I may not have exported yet. So let me actually go ahead and export that while I'm thinking about it. But yeah, they all end up there. So, but I think you can also, you know, yeah, I think it's 2 weeks also, which is why I usually remember to do last week's when I get ready to stream. But it's been a couple weeks since I streamed, so I should do that right now before it disappears. And I got that started. So yeah, thanks for the reminder. Anyway, yeah, so Padron, I don't get it, but all right, let's go on. Jackie. So this gold Jackie. So this is the mission one. So I guess you need three of the other five, right? So it's four packables, three of which are cheap packables, four packables, and a clubhouse, right? So that also means then that the mission value of the clubhouse Jackie is going to be pretty close to zero because you should just fill this one with the three cheap ones, presumably, right? Okay, I guess he also is in this diamond mission as well, so he has a little more mission value. Um, anyway, as for the gold, so this is the mission one. This is again much better versus lefties, but sort of minimally viable versus righties. And yeah, so second, third, left, no shortstop eligibility. Um, okay, so first off, versus left, uh, this is going to be a really good bat, but it's still, because it doesn't have that power, at least in modern, it's not going to be your best versus lefty bats. So in low gold you've got this Lee Lacy is probably going to be better because he has the 106 power as well. Pumpsy Green, same thing. He's got the 111 power and sort of most of what Jackie gets. Jackie's much better defensively. But even so, that means it's going to be more second than someplace like third or left. Third and left, I'm more willing to stick a bat. And yeah, so even second, I mean, the bat's good, but I might just put Pumpsy there. I might put Rennie Stinnett there, who at least has a glove. If you got the PTCS Connie Day, then that's going to be much stronger both ways. So yeah, even though this is a good bat, it's not as good as the splitty bats, and it's not good enough VR. Yeah, so it just doesn't play, does it? Yeah, I've got it as the third best two-way option at second, for example. But you'd rather play Connie Day, and you'd probably rather play Nellie Fox because there are enough righties you just live with it, or platoon something. Well, Pumpsy does make a lot of VL bats tough, but yeah, I guess I have 6 weeks on something. It looks like I didn't try to work out which, but I get 6 weeks for something. Yeah, so I think Jackie just doesn't play. It's a lot of points for a card that doesn't play, but I guess the fact that he doesn't have the power of VL is a problem, and then yeah, the bat's just not quite good enough. If the card played short, I'd be more interested, but it doesn't. Yeah, okay, I guess it's an F. It's a lot of points to end up in F, but it really just doesn't play, does it? Huh. I think. Okay, no, you know what? In the hold on. In the low gold, it's going to play VL, isn't it? Because then the power doesn't hurt. Yeah, okay. It plays in the low gold. So, and that is kind of a quarter of the gold. All right. So it's probably like a D minus then, because it is going to play VL in low gold. And there you can run a full platoon. Yeah, Mr. Black. Yeah, I was just noticing that. Yeah. All right. So it's probably like a D minus. Okay, so then so far Pop is worth the missions. The others are probably too expensive to this point, uh, unless you're kind of going for one of the higher end rewards. So then let's look at the next mission, which is Easterling. Because to be fair, the Jackie mission's not as hard as some of the others as well. All right, so Easterling. So 94 range does play short. But yeah, the bat's just behind, is a fair bit behind the ones we're talking about. So you'd rather have a card. Yeah, this is actually just worse than Pop VR for sure. So it's significantly worse than Pop VR. The extra outfield doesn't help you so much because the bat's not good enough. Does help that it's a little bit more balanced, I guess. No, he's still just behind Pop. Yeah, all right. This also just doesn't play. It's behind Pop, and this one isn't even going to get fixed in early eras or something like that. Yeah. Okay. All right. Dandridge then. So, all right. So now we're up to full gold, and this is a little bit better bat than the ones we just looked at. So we're still behind. Yeah, we're probably still behind Pop VR though, pretty clearly. It's a better bat VL. Let's see, it's behind Connie Day both ways. This is actually going to be in a pretty similar spot to Jackie, although it's a different shape. It's more sort of BABIP heavy. This is the card. This card would have beat out Jackie with that BABIP in the low gold dead ball, except that it's no longer low gold eligible. So yeah, it's a pretty similar spot to Jackie then, isn't it? Uh, which I guess means at the moment there's just nowhere for him to play because there's no early era full gold. So maybe we'll give him an F plus instead of an F because if that comes about in a tournament refresh, then he would play it. But without that in a refresh, it just doesn't work, does it? All right, then we're up to we're up to low diamond already. All right, Slim Jones. So I'm guessing just from the price that there's not a lot of interest in it. If it's a newly released low diamond that's going for under 20K. But let's just find a good comparison. So let's see. So he does have, I mean, actually a fair number of points here. So I'm a little surprised that this card doesn't have more interest. He's got 93 stamina, so that means it's probably a card that's going to be more interesting than some of the lives, right? Um, we've got a lefty. We've got a lefty with pretty even split, so that's also interesting. So I guess the card that it's most similar to in power levels, maybe something like this Lance Lynn, versus Wright. But Lynn's a card that kind of has been fringy in the meta, right? So I think we'd expect Slim to be similar. Yeah, my model has him sort of as the eighth best starter, but still ninth best pitcher in low diamond. But he's also got more stamina than some of the ones above him, and more importantly, because he's a lefty that can face righties, this is a card that's going to convert to the bullpen really well. So I think he should be. I think he should be in the meta somewhere. I think I'd rather run him out of the pen if I have a really full build. So probably something like a C. And hey, Grizz, welcome. And yeah, see, it seems like he should be okay in low diamond. So low diamond, there have been a couple lefties there because like Matlack is starting there now. If you have him from gold, Wilbur Cooper from the live missions was playable. The clubhouse Ted Lilly was playable. So there are some lefties. And actually, I think with Slim Jones, this opens up the option of trying to run a 5 lefty rotation and getting away with it. I mean, you're skipping a couple of the other good releases like the Ramon Martinez and Walter Johnson, but I think there are enough lefties you could try it if you wanted to go a bit contrarian as well. So yeah, this seems like a pretty solid card. It's still probably a bullpen card on release if you have a complete, full collection. So yeah, something like a C. And then we've got, so this is the clubhouse Jackie. Huge gap power. Okay, so this is shortstop only. So you're going to lose that flexibility, right? Yeah, so we're going to lose the flexibility, and he's got a floor on his price, basically, because he costs clubhouse stars. So for this card to work, it's basically got to be the best shortstop in low diamond, or else it's not going to work. So the main comparison is going to be Jeter, which is one of these launch deck mission cards and also shortstop only. So you really can't play both of them. You'd have to play one of them and find a backup, from elsewhere. And I think if we do the side-by-side comparison, what we'll see is it's reasonably close. So Jackie's better defensively, right? Jeter has this 89 range. If I owned both cards, I would just, put them up side by side. Both of them are maybe slightly better versus lefties, but Jackie's more balanced, and Jackie has kind of the better glove. So it seems pretty clear that Jackie's going to be better versus right. Jeter's going to be, better versus left. And overall, just because there are more righties in the meta, that means Jackie's the better of the two, which means the card should be viable. And if you have to play one two ways, then the bats come out really about equal. with the current mix of righties and lefties. But then Jackie's glove's a little better. So I think if you find people are running five lefties, you might still go Jeter, but otherwise it seems like Jackie basically should get rid of Jeter. Um, so, if you had Jeter instead, that's probably, you have to think about whether you would spend clubhouse stars on Jackie to get the upgrade. On the other hand, it does have the advantage of getting Derek Jeter off of your team, which is a Sox fan, 100% approve. Uh, so for that alone, the card's clearly like an S with several pluses. Otherwise, it's probably like an A or a B. Um, yeah, maybe even closer to an A simply because Jeter also doesn't have a variant option. So there's nobody that's going to have a variant Jeter that's basically strong enough to block this or something like that. So yeah, that probably bumps it up a little bit. So yeah, probably maybe like an A minus then. Um, you've also had enough of Jeter. All right, fair enough then. Um, oh, you're a Yankee fan. I don't know if we can be in the same stream here now. All right, Parnell. So this is kind of another of the higher end mission rewards. Okay, it says he pitches. Okay, but looking at the pitching ratings, well, so if you draft this card as a third, basically you can use as a 13th pitcher maybe. So the pitching's maybe not a complete zero from that point of view in a draft or an open cap. Everywhere else the pitching is a zero. So and he really has to be an outfielder with that defense, right? Yeah, he has to be an outfielder with that defense. But now the problem is the bat's just not very good. And you lose all that power in an early era. So, yeah, it's just not going to work. It's just kind of not a low diamond bat. Even as a gold bat, I think this one would struggle a little bit. It's not as far behind the gold bats, but it's certainly behind the splittier ones. As a two-way bat, though, it's not an F minus. As a two-way bat, this would be better than your gold options for sure. Um, actually, now that I think about it, I wonder if that's the thing to do with the gold Jackie with all those points. There's so many of these splitty outfielders. Does he maybe have some value running him in left? So you run him in left one way, Lee Lacy for sure the other way. Yeah, you know what? I think there's enough value for Jackie and left that's where, because there were so many points in that gold card, it just looked weird that we couldn't find somewhere for it to play. I think it's more like a C. I think it's going to be more like a C because I think you can run that card in left in modern if you don't have Benintendi say, and it's not a disaster. And then he gives you a lot of flexibility, right? So yeah, maybe that then makes the most sense. So yeah, so Grizz, there isn't really a website. I guess you can find all of the historical stuff on YouTube somewhere probably or in our archive. Um, there's not a public Discord that I'm on that goes through it, but I'm always happy to answer questions. If you ping me on Discord, I'm always happy to answer questions about stuff. Um, but yeah, there's not a public Discord where all this stuff got dumped or something. Yeah, see, Max LP, I think that's the idea. There are enough of these splitty cards in gold. Yeah, I think actually probably Jackie should be on the roster for his left field value then. Even though normally if you have a bat like that and you're at all viable in the infield, that's not what you want to do. I think that's the place to make him work. Yeah, I think you just run him in left. Okay, so you are running him in left. So all right, so at least I'm not the only one thinking along those lines then. All right, next we got what? Piper Davis. Let's see, listed at second. Yeah, and with the glove, this is really a second baseman shape. So should be a second baseman. Um, that's a tough spot to break into because you've got Morgan and Knobloch from the Missions. Christian Campbell can play second and is really good. Giles from the Mission isn't bad. Yeah, so this is a good card. There are a lot of points here. I still have him as the 10th best second baseman VR just because of all of the mission rewards and all of the other strong cards that have, kind of been second base eligible. So I actually end up having him a little bit higher in the list at third just because there aren't as many of these cards that play third. Even though just as a card and with that defense shape, this should be a second baseman. But I guess in both cases, not only is this sort of a little bit too far behind, yeah, shortstop, I've also got him like seventh or eighth. So it's just toward the bottom of the top 10 in most of these. I think as a low diamond, it would have been closer, but this it's just so crowded. The card's just a little bit behind some of these really good mission rewards. Um, yeah, and even as a variant, it doesn't quite jump up there. All right, yeah, I think this one doesn't play. Uh, all right, what do we got? We got only. All right, we're getting there. Good, yeah, because we got a bit of a late start, and I still want to still should get to sleep at some point, right? All right, Max Manning. So this is, let's see, okay, so it's a clubhouse shop card. So basically, now here the clubhouse shop prices get a little bit better, only in the sense that kind of the minimum fair price for this in terms of packs and stuff is going to be 70 to 80K. But a lot of new diamond releases are in that range, so it's a little bit easier for a card to kind of be worth that, on the market if it's good. And as for whether it's good, I think this is entirely, or at least almost entirely, going to come down to the splits. Um, so this is by a decent margin, kind of this and maybe Bill Doak are the two. Versus righties, these are your, clearly two best options in Diamond. So Manning is excellent versus righties. That's just going to work. Okay. Now versus lefties, he's obviously a lot weaker than versus right, and the colors, kind of exaggerate that a bit even. But having said that, if you look at sort of what everybody else looks like versus left, he's not bad. So the best righty versus lefties in Diamond is this Marischal. This card really works both ways. The other one that's up there is going to be Jim Palmer. So Manning, unlike those two, really is pretty splitty, but he's splitty because he's so excellent against righties. And he's kind of, about third against lefties of these righties. So as a result, I think this is just going to be an excellent starter. He will clobber all the righties in the lineup. So if you have a mixture of righties and lefties, then the card should be really good. If you run an opener for him, he should be excellent. But if he really has to face lefties, he's going to be okay. So I think this is at least a solid A. Let's see, is he ever playing up into, perfect? I guess that's hard because there becomes a big gap, right? So, Marshall maybe really did. Marshall really is sort of more an S plus on release. Is this card going to play up? I mean, he's kind of competitive with Marshall, right? Yeah, he's kind of competitive with Marshall, isn't he? Yeah, I think you could play this in an open tournament. So if you could play it in an open tournament, I think this is an S plus. I think this is going to be the strongest. Well, it's certainly the strongest of the current clubhouse set, but I think this is probably an S plus. So both this and the Diamond Jackie look like really good cards. Um, yeah. So good. So I think those two are hits. So I think looking at the current clubhouse shop releases, these two, are worth it. Singer, I also think was certainly worth the 50. So I did buy Singer. I think I'll probably buy Jackie and Manning. I'm not 100% convinced, so I won't do it like right now on stream. I do want to think a little bit, but I think they're probably going to be worth the value. Um, the others I'd say are pretty clearly not from the new releases. Um, all right, and then we got Biz Mackey. I promised myself I would not make any puns about the card being just a friend or anything. So we'll avoid that for this stream. What he is an okay defensive catcher with a pretty big bat. Um, so at catcher, well, let's see. I guess it doesn't matter so much. Normally I kind of make the point that my model really likes the bigger gloves, like the cards like Molina or something like that. But in this case, I'm not sure it matters that much because he's also a little bit behind, so he's behind a card like Cochran one way. Um, he's behind the mission, Gary Carter, VL. So he's also a little bit behind the bats, I guess. He's kind of right in that next tier where it's close, but he's probably just a little bit behind. And some of the cards that he's slightly behind are also cards that you're getting from the live missions, and so they're going to be a little bit easier, maybe than the packable. Exactly, Oki. You get what I'm saying. Um, so Grizz, the thing about the Jackie is we already have some mission like that, right? So we have this Jackie unlock where you have to collect three of these five, and so it's uh, three cheaper packables, the three low end, one really expensive packable, and then the clubhouse card. And so you need three of the five. So it is part of that mission. But right now, if you just wanted to buy your way to the mission, you can buy the three cheaper ones much more easily than the clubhouse card. So I think that would be the way to do it. Um, okay, yeah. So as for Biz, I think because the cards he's competing with include these mission rewards, it's going to be hard to play him at catcher. And he just gets worse at all the other positions, because the bat is good for a diamond catcher, just not quite as good as the best ones out there. It certainly isn't a good bat for anything else. Uh, okay, there is one other thing to consider. Um, I've seen a few weird ideas for builds playing with the stamina stuff, where you want to figure out a way to run a 14th pitcher. I don't think that makes the most sense, and I think if it really does make the most sense, you want to do it with a two-way player instead. But if you somehow wanted to get a 12-player depth chart, this is like by far, not even close, even in open, this is sort of by far your best catcher that also plays every position, right? I mean, he plays every position, but even if you're going to use him at four positions, this is by far your best backup catcher who can back up whichever two other positions you need. And so I think for that reason, even if as a catcher the card doesn't quite play, there probably are some clever reasons to use it. So it's probably going to be more like a C or D, depending on how clever you can, be with the card. Maybe I'll say something like C minus, but that's really a guess because it comes down to, do you find some clever ways to use this in builds where he's backing up a bunch of positions, or do you just never get the value? Yeah, and I guess also, from a chemistry point of view, he'll have good chemistry with all the other Negro League cards. All right, finally we're up to the perfects. I suppose we've got to discuss Candy Jim Taylor, don't we? Who sadly is not worth 190, and even if you sell him for 190, you haven't gotten as much value, et cetera, et cetera. He's got power. It's pretty empty power. Uh, you know, it's also at third base where there are a bunch of other interesting options that, maybe don't have as much power, but have all these other things, including this packable Jackie, by the way. This is he plays second, third, but looking at the ratings, I think this card does want to be a second baseman, but it's also a better third baseman than Candy Jim. Hannes is certainly going to be, a better one than Candy Jim. Um, from a bat point of view, like Pujols is going to have a bigger bat. Yeah, so certainly this isn't the kind of high end card that you would need. Sorry, not this one. The Jackie is a better card. We'll get there a second. And I guess I don't even see the pitching ratings in the. So maybe someone can tell me if someone's looked at the card. Am I right that he doesn't have any pitching ratings? I mean, he has a pitcher position rating, but the card shop doesn't show the pitching ratings. So I'm assuming that he doesn't have a viable pitching rating at all. If he does, that could change the, you know, yeah. So okay, so if the pitching's useless, then yeah, it's probably going to be mostly empty power. This card is going to be better in drafts simply because or like an open cap, that's where the power is going to help you more, right? Okay, thanks. All right, so the pitching is really not viable. Yeah, so then this is just behind a card like Pujols. It's, for open caps, he'll beat up on the back end of bullpens with that power a little bit, but that's about all you're going to get. Um, it's probably an upgrade if you're not running a perfect at third yet, but it's not the sort of thing you want to pay a couple 100,000 points for. Um, and certainly Jackie's going to be better, but Pujols is in the couple 100,000 points range also, and Pujols will go down as more of them get packed, whereas this card shouldn't. Uh, and there's some mission value, but that's about it, I guess. All right, so I don't want to be too harsh in grading sort of the perfects where at this stage in the cycle, they're often upgrades because a lot of people, they're not really running 26 perfects on the roster yet. If you're in that situation, then, Candy Jim is going to be an upgrade. Uh, you have to be careful not to run him at second or short in league that is a potential disaster. Like he really has to run at third, and he's going to be a bad defensive third baseman in league. Um, all right, so maybe the card's like a D. It's definitely not something I'm going to spend a couple $100,000 on. Okay. As for uh, the Jackie on the other hand, this is an excellent defensive second baseman. If he could play short, he'd be good there too. Um, he is also a good defensive left fielder. But I think with that shape, so I do actually have him as the best VR left fielder as well, and it's not bad to have the flexibility. I think I'd rather run him at second, but maybe it's the case that if you have Carew there or something, one way. Maybe what you want to do is run him at left one way, and then versus lefties, you put him at second or something. I think that's viable. Um, he certainly would be okay at third also. Second's the naturally best place for the card, though. But he is a starter at a couple positions on release, at least versus right. So I think the card's at least like a solid A or A plus. Is it S tier? I mean, it's not really pushing the meta forward. It's not even the best card both ways. Uh, and you're probably not getting as much for the stealing ability. So yeah, it's probably like a solid A plus. It's um, yeah. Yeah, I think so. I think that's right. I think if I just look at Candy Jim as a card, D is probably fair. I'm never buying him. Right? Yeah, exactly. I think that's the point. He'd be a 40K packable, but he'd be the kind of 40K packable where he would actually then be a cheap upgrade to add to your roster, and he'd be a reasonably cheap upgrade for people that are looking to, not quite spend a few 100,000 points on a meta third baseman, but still upgrade their roster, right? Um, all right, and then we got Satchel Page. So unlike the first Satchel we got before, this one has a lot more stamina, which is important. He's still not the huge stamina card that I think he could have been, but everybody's stamina has been lower. But otherwise, I mean, there's just a ton of points on this card, and it's really hard to kind of find the weakness. So put this card up against, say, where did Jackson Joe? There he is. You know, Sats just has a little bit more and is a similar kind of shape. In fact, I also have him as better than Feller. Um, just the control, especially versus lefties, is a tiny weakness for Feller. Um, and Page has more. Uh, so Page to me really does look like the clear S plus. He's better than the PTCS card that just got released. He's pushing the meta forward a bit. Uh, this is now your best starting pitcher in the game, and as such, he should last. You know, he'll eventually get surpassed as all of these cards do. But if he's the best on release, he'll last even in the bullpen probably for a few months. That seems to be the typical life cycle. So yeah, this I think is the clear card of the set, and it makes sense that this is the big mission topper rather than the Jackie. Um, this is the one you most want to acquire, and it's probably a pretty easy comparison. Okay, and then finally we got Cool Papa. Um, okay, so 101 range, which is good but not really meta pushing in the outfield. Uh, the speed is, again, good but not really quite meta pushing. So center field seems to be the best place for him given this shape. Yeah, he's going to have slightly better ratings in the corners, but center field with this shape is probably the most useful place if you get the card. So what that means is the direct comparison is going to be something like Richie Ashburn. and I have them pretty similar versus right. So versus right, I have this Ashburn very slightly ahead. Ashburn's missing the power, of course. They both have the 101 range. Um, but Ashburn, the enormous eye really does help. Especially in league when you're doing some normalization there. And the low power is just a zero power. Um, so I think I slightly prefer Ashburn versus right, but then Cool Papa is much better than Ashburn versus left. And he's a switch hitter as well. So that helps with your platoon stuff. So if you're running a platoon in center, maybe you still go Ashburn McCutcheon or even try to stick Tyler O'Neill there. As a two-way card, I think you always want Bell. Now, if he doesn't play center, it becomes a little bit trickier because even though he plays the other corners, we do have bigger bats available in the corners. We have, for example, the Jackie we just talked about, but a Roman Anthony, Tyler O'Neill, Zach Wheat one way, Winfield the other way, Bellinger, the Baseball Reference one, Bellinger one way. So there are enough good corner bats that I do think you have to play Cool Papa in center to make the card work. So it really is a direct comparison between Bell and Ashburn. I always want the flexibility and the positional flexibility for roster building. So if it's comparable, then I think you should prefer Bell. So I think he should be the winner, even if Ashburn's a little better versus right. As someone that already has Ashburn, I don't think I'm then going to be motivated to get Bell because I don't think he's enough of an improvement. But if I didn't have Ashburn and then I were kind of looking to get one card, then if the prices are similar, I'd go for Bell. So I do think he's your starting center fielder. He's only very slightly pushing the meta, and the corners don't help so much. So maybe it's something like a B. It's a useful card. He should be a starter. He's also skippable if you don't have the points, and you're not really losing out on a ton if you go for the cheaper option. Because what is Ashburn going for now? Let me see. Yeah, Ashburn you can get for under 40K. So yeah, I think given that you can get Ashburn for under 40K, I think in practice I wouldn't go for Bell. I think there are just too many other improvements. But if the cards were similarly priced, Bell's the better card. If you have a chance to, pick any center fielder you want to in a draft, Bell I think is the center fielder you want to pick in a draft. So from that point of view, it is leading the meta. All right, we made it actually in a reasonable amount of time, which is good. Let's do a TWIP draft actually before we go. Let's do. Oh, I can sign up for something, and then we can do a TWIP draft. Yeah. I'd rather play the cap. See, that's what I get for not paying attention to this while streaming, right? All right, I'll do a speed draft also, but I can do that afterward. Let's do a TWIP draft. We always have awful TWIP drafts on stream, so I think that's a good one to do before we finish. I did create an alt that literally only plays TWIPed just to be able to do it, so Oh, and you know what? I'll take a suggestion if anyone has one. We should come up with a funny team name each week, maybe, if we're doing this. So, open to suggestions for kind of a funny thing to include in the roll call, if anyone's got one. But in the meantime, let's do one TWIP draft. See if our luck continues, or if we actually can get a good draft for once. Let's see. So we're at Naven. So righty home run, otherwise flat, modern era, right? And all right, well, okay, it's Clary Bruthers. Yeah, I guess there's not that much interesting to say here. It's four really difficult cards to play. I don't hate wit if we had ended up going in that direction with the positional scarcity, but Bruiser's it's a big bat. It's a single elimination. We actually have to pick two of them. Okay, then we're going wit. So there's an argument for Bobby Wheat, but just with the positional flexibility, yeah. Drop the price of Nintendos. Could do that. Oh, you know what else could be fun? What is Dish's team name? What is Dish's team name this year? We could just pick the same team name and logo and see what happens. That could be fun. Wow, this round. I think our TWIP luck may be continuing. And we've got to pick two of these. We've got to pick two of these. All right. Here, I'll put a poll up. Churchy Chocolate Kings, that's what it is. All right, I'll put a poll up. I'll put a quick poll up, and we'll see what you think will work best. Uh, in the meantime, oh boy, we've got to choose two of these, don't we? Well, let's see what we've got. We've got a catcher who can't catch. We've got a bad live bat. We've got another bad live bat. Reverse split reliever that, yeah, okay, fine. All right, we've got two reverse split relievers that we could go with, and an even worse bat. I think we're going to end up going with two relievers somehow, right? Yeah, you know what? It's single elimination, actually. So investing in the bullpen makes sense if you're trying to squeeze out a couple round wins. Let's go reliever. We're at least getting okay cards. Oh boy. Okay. Well. Oh boy. I don't even know what to do with this. Uh, okay. Robbie Thompson has a glove, kinda. Uh, yeah, it's an awful bat and an awful glove. This is does everything except pitch frames, so he does everything except actually be a good catcher. Okay, bad reliever. Okay, well, Alvarado could be good if he doesn't walk anybody. Hey, that could be. Yeah. Oh boy. Well, all right. I think just as a Red Sox fan, you always take the Yankee flipper, right? Always take the Yankee flipper. All right, we're going with the first round buys for our team name. All right, always take the Yankee flipper. And then uh, Alvarado. Why not? Um, all right, okay. All right, Manoa is good. Fawn is good. A couple of these others are fine, but like, all right, we actually got a playable round. This is an improvement. Um, Torrey is at least new, and I guess it's Necro by default. Yeah, it's Necro by default, I suppose. We are having our usual TWIP luck, I think. Um, yeah, okay. Mayo is at least new-ish, even if he's not very good. I mean, Blades is a mission card, but this is such a bad mission card, it doesn't work. We could go Wilbur Wood, we could just keep throwing knuckleballs at him and see what happens. I'm thinking it's just Tovar. I mean, this is the best shape of these. Yeah, at least take a card that has some value, right? Yeah. All right, let's go Tovar. All right. Trey Morgan's fine, and I mean, it doesn't even matter at this point. I think. Uh, um, yeah. Hmm. There's no. Wow. Um. Hmm. All right. Well, Pilar is a good backup glove, I guess. All right. You know what? Let me just click through. All right. Simmons is a player that exists. Uh, Connie Mack. Yeah, we're gonna run out. All right, whatever. We're gonna run out of catchers. Yeah. Yeah. This is just completely dead, isn't it? All right. All right. Well, I think we're up to our usual performance in these. Um, yeah. We also only have managed to find one outfielder so far. I feel like that may be fewer than, is optimal somehow. I mean, I'm no expert, but then they've all been awful. So, yeah. All right. That's probably Brazier, isn't it? Um, all right, we're gonna have to take like five outfielders in the last round. That'll be fine, right? Where by five outfielders I mean two. Uh, we even ran ourselves out of outfielders somehow. Now that is an accomplishment. We actually managed to even run ourselves out of outfielders in this draft. All right. So the lesson is you don't just have to count catchers, you also have to count outfielders. All right, I think we are losing this draft, but that's a good one to end on. So is there anybody that was planning on streaming that would like to fire something up and have me raid? If not, it looks like Ezra Denny's going. I can raid him. Okay, I'll give you a minute. Let me know. Let me know if someone was going to fire up a stream. I saw a couple people were in here, like Kava that do stream. So if you were going to do that, you're welcome to fire it up, and I can raid in. Otherwise, let me raid Ezra, who's also fun. Um, oh, let me just click through because I'm probably behind. Yeah, I'm probably behind on that. Aren't actually that way. Um, Yeah, so all right, why don't we raid into Ezra then, and we'll kind of go from there. Uh, hopefully, next week I don't think I'm traveling, so I should be around. And good luck with all your stuff. Yeah, let me know if anything else that people wanted me to go over before kind of rating. All right, I'm not seeing much, so all right, let me go raid Ezra then, and thanks a lot, and hopefully see a bunch of y'all next week.